The whistle had blown, and the day had just started when the boiler room let go. The first sound was not a crack, but a deep thud that moved through the floors like a shove. Men and women looked up from cutting benches and stitching machines. A few thought someone had dropped a crate. Then the whole building lifted. Windows burst. Steam and brick and splinters came up the stairwells as if the factory had been kicked from below. People ran for the doors, but the hall filled with white heat and smoke, and the stairs were gone. It happened at the R.B. Grover Shoe Factory in Brockton, Massachusetts. The place was 4 stories of wood built in the shape of an E, with a brick boiler house tucked into the back. 300 people or more worked there, making Emerson shoes on long lines of machines. They had just settled in that morning when a steel boiler in the brick house exploded and turned the factory into a trap. The blast hurled the boiler like a battering ram through the nearest wall. It smashed into a water tower and dumped the tank straight down through the roof. An entire wing pancaked, roof onto top floor, top onto the floors below. Workers who survived the drop were pinned by beams and iron frames, their hands still curled as if they held tools. Burning coals from the firebox rained across the wreckage and found gas lines that had snapped. Fire ran where there had been air. The heat climbed until iron pipes sagged. The old wooden floors, oiled nightly to keep down dust, caught like tinder. Across the street, the Campello firehouse heard the blast and felt the shake. Firefighters were on scene in minutes, joined by neighbors who ran with axes and lengths of timber. They levered beams and pulled people free when they could, dragging them to the street before the flames reached them. In places, the rescuers had to stop because heat rolled over the ruin like a wall. They watched men and women they could not reach and lived with that sight for the rest of their days. In the parts of the factory that still stood, workers fought to get out. Some ran down stairways that held long enough. Others climbed to the roof or jumped when fire choked the halls. The explosion had ripped away some of the fire escapes as if they were string. People broke windows and took their chances. By noon, the main block had burned to a black shell and the ground still hissed. The count became the cruel work that followed. 58 people died. About 150 were injured. Many families never saw more than a fragment to bury. 39 of the dead, too burned to identify, were placed together in Melrose Cemetery during a public funeral that drew the whole town. Others were named only after a survivor remembered a cuff or a ring. The chief engineer, a man named Rockwell, had checked his gauges that morning and taken a seat by the boiler room window. His wife saw him there from their house nearby not long before the blast. When the smoke cleared enough for a search, they found what was left of him near his chair. Inspectors took the fittings apart piece by piece. They said the boiler had not run out of water. They argued over age, over metal tired by years of heat and hammering, over seams that had stretched and been patched 1 year too many. The factory's shape and materials did the rest. Wooden floors and open space meant the blast had room to run. Hundreds of windows, blown out in an instant, turned what was left into a chimney. Machinery bolted to floors became traps when the floors fell. Even a shed behind the boiler house became a weapon. It held barrels of naphtha, a solvent as quick to burn as gasoline. The fire reached the shed and the shed exploded, throwing flame across the wreck and driving rescuers back. The city tried to help the living while it counted the lost. A relief fund took shape before the ashes cooled, with small envelopes of cash put into hands that had lost their wage earner. Some injured workers walked home in shock and turned up on lists later only because a neighbor told the police they were alive. One dazed man left the scene, found work at another shoe shop for the day, and came home to find mourners on his steps. Stories like that gave the town something to hold that was not only grief. By mid-morning, the streets filled with families searching for names. Lists were nailed to a board by the gate and changed by the hour. A line of closed wagons carried the dead to a temporary morgue. 3 days later, the city held a public funeral for 39 who could not be named. Bells tolled while simple coffins went into the ground side by side at Melrose Cemetery. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways with hats in their hands. Children were told to keep quiet because the town was listening. The disaster made noise far beyond Brockton. Boilers had been blowing for years in mills and ships and schools, and the country had been slow to set rules. This time the pictures were too clear. The ruins lay in a busy neighborhood, and reporters could count bodies as they came out. Manufacturers argued that heavy rules would strangle trade. Families of the dead said trade had already strangled enough. Within a few years, Massachusetts created a board of boiler rules and passed laws that required inspection and set basic operating standards. Engineers pressed for a national code. Piece by piece, those pages arrived. None of that fixed what had happened on the ground that morning. The owner stood by the gate and read names as they came in from the morgue. He paid what he could into the relief fund and went under anyway. The R.B. Grover Company failed within weeks. Some said that was justice. Others said it was only one more ruin on a street filled with loss. The truth was simpler. Insurance money did not mend families, and it did not bring back hands that had learned a trade. Years later, men told their sons where the building had stood. They pointed to the corner where the boiler house had been, and to the line of sky where the tank had fallen through. They said the fire had burned hot enough to melt the iron ribs of radiators. They said a person could still find a smooth pebble of glass in the dirt if he looked long enough after a hard rain. Divers down the coast spoke of other mill towns and other blasts, and said the code had saved lives, but only when people followed it. What made the day so hard to forget was how ordinary it had been until it wasn't. Workers had hung coats, sharpened blades, checked oil cups. Someone had cut the twine off a new bundle of leather. A clerk had opened a ledger and dipped a pen. Then steel failed inside a brick room, and a factory became a furnace in less than a minute. People tried doors that had been there an hour earlier and found only heat where the door should have been. It happened that fast. If you walked that street later, you saw new walls and a different sign. Factories always tried to rise again. But the town did not forget the names carved on the stone and the rows in the cemetery where numbers stood in for faces. You did not have to be a shoemaker to know what had gone wrong. Old pressure vessels, light rules, quick profits, and a building made to burn. Those were the gears that turned together. When they slipped, people paid. Road to ruins was always this: systems that held until the day they didn't. In Brockton, the system was steam and wood and habit, and it came apart in a breath. If laws and inspections that followed kept another boiler from letting go, they were written in more than ink. They were written in the heat that drove rescuers back and the long lists in the paper the next day. They were written in 58 names. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.